Your 20s are essentially a massive pit of financial quicksand. You are standing there, utterly paralyzed, watching all your friends casually sign up for hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loans to acquire fancy, prestigious degrees that will ultimately land them a minimum wage job pulling espresso shots at Starbucks. They desperately convince themselves that this crushing mountain of non-dischargeable debt is a smart investment. Meanwhile, you are panicking, wondering if you are falling behind by not following the herd. The brutal truth is that the vast majority of people approach their early education and investments completely backwards. They are buying wildly overpriced paper certificates to soothe their deep insecurities, rather than acquiring the brutal, practical skills that the market actually pays for. Your choices right now will permanently alter your trajectory. And that is not motivational language. That is ledger language. That is forensic accounting applied to a human life. When you strip away the sentiment, the graduation photos, the campus tours, the polished brochures, the moral blackmail about what a good future is supposed to look like, what you are left with is a sequence of financial decisions made at the exact moment you are least equipped to understand their downstream consequences. You are asked at 18 or 19 to sign complex contracts for an asset whose cash flow profile is uncertain, whose resale value is zero, whose maintenance cost is ongoing, and whose debt burden is often immune to the clean reset mechanisms available for almost every other catastrophic financial mistake. You are told this is maturity. You are told this is ambition. You are told this is the price of becoming someone. But if you looked at the same structure in any other industry, if a salesperson persuaded a teenager to borrow six figures for a product with vague outcomes, non-transparent pricing, aggressive emotional framing, and no guaranteed income generation, you would recognize it instantly for what it is: a predatory financial abuse industry targeting insecurity before judgment has fully matured. The first thing you need to understand is that the problem is not education. The problem is ROI. The problem is that most people have never been taught to think like capital allocators, so they commit one of the most expensive category errors of their lives. They confuse social approval with return on investment. They confuse prestige with earnings power. They confuse psychological safety with actual safety. They buy the expensive story because the cheap truth terrifies them. The cheap truth is that no institution can protect you from the market if you remain economically irrelevant. The market does not care how moving your campus experience was. It does not care how impressive the architecture looked on brochure day. It does not care how much debt you absorb to signal seriousness. It cares about one thing with brutal consistency. Can you solve problems, create revenue, save time, reduce pain, lower risk, or produce outcomes that other people will pay for? Everything else is decorative. This is why the math becomes so horrifying so quickly. Imagine two versions of you at 22. One version walks into adulthood with a clean balance sheet, a usable skill stack, and the humility to learn. The other version walks in with $100,000 of non-dischargeable debt at an interest rate that quietly eats through every early paycheck. The first version can invest. The second version must triage. The first version can take asymmetric bets, move cities, start a small business, accept a low-paid apprenticeship with high upside, or survive a few months of uncertainty while building competence. The second version cannot breathe without servicing old decisions, and this is the real violence of the debt trap. It does not merely cost you money, it destroys optionality, it steals time, it delays experimentation, it turns your 20s, which should be the most agile decade of your life, into a debt management exercise. People talk about compound interest as if it is a nice concept you will think about later, sometime in your 30s when life becomes serious. But compound interest is not waiting politely in the corner. It is either working for you right now or it is working against you right now. If you begin adulthood sending hundreds or thousands of dollars every month into the black hole of old loans, that money is not being invested into assets, businesses, index funds, relationships, health, relocation, or skill acquisition. It is being used to erase the cost of a story you were sold before you had the mathematical literacy to interrogate it. And then, insultingly, you are told this is normal. You are told everybody does it. You are told debt is just part of life. That is the language of normalization used by every system that depends on your compliance. If you can be made to feel strange for questioning a terrible deal, then the deal can continue indefinitely. So step back and look at the arithmetic without sentiment. $100,000 borrowed in early adulthood is not just $100,000. It is interest. It is monthly minimums. It is the career choices you can no longer make. It is the apartment you cannot leave. It is the business you do not start. It is the risk you cannot take when the upside is highest. It is the emotional fatigue of beginning every month already behind. And most devastatingly, it is the lost compounding on capital you never got to own in the first place. If you had even a modest amount invested consistently in your 20s, the time horizon itself would do a large portion of the work. Time is the most valuable multiplier you possess when you are young, and debt converts that multiplier into a burden-bearing apparatus for someone else's institution. That is why this is not a casual mistake. It is a structural impairment. It is like trying to run a marathon while carrying furniture you did not need to buy. Now, here is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, because the traditional degree gospel is protected by layers of family pride, social conditioning, class anxiety, and pure herd behavior. People do not defend the degree pathway only because it works. They defend it because it grants narrative certainty. It gives parents a sentence they can repeat to themselves. It gives peers a synchronized ritual. It gives nervous young adults a script when they do not yet trust themselves to think independently. And for certain professions, yes, formal credentials remain necessary. If you are pursuing paths that require licensure, specialized accreditation, or intense technical rigor that cannot be replicated through informal means, that is a separate calculation. But that is precisely the point. It should be a calculation. Specific, cold, disciplined. Not a default religion. Not a vague belief that paying more must mean earning more. Not a moral reflex. A calculated investment strategy. What is the total cost? What is the likely income range? What is the median time to employability? What is the debt service burden? What is the opportunity cost of 4 years out of the market? What practical skills will you leave with? How many graduates are underemployed? How quickly can the capital be recovered? If you cannot answer those questions, you are not making an investment. You are participating in a ritual, and rituals are expensive when financed at interest. The truly destabilizing realization in your 20s is that the highest ROI education is often painfully unglamorous. It does not come wrapped in institutional prestige. It usually looks like a $20 book written by someone who actually built something, not someone whose career depends on theorizing from a protected distance. It looks like a $100 specialized online course that teaches a narrow skill with immediate market application. It looks like cheap software and a refusal to be embarrassed while you practice in public. It looks like taking a small freelance job before you feel ready. It looks like learning how to write persuasive emails, run ads, build websites, close clients, analyze data, edit short-form video, design landing pages, automate workflows, or sell a premium offer to a real human being. That is the sort of learning that alters a balance sheet. That is the sort of education that pays rent. That is the sort of education that compounds because it is connected directly to output. And yes, it lacks the theater of prestige. Nobody frames your certificate from a random course in a mahogany office. Nobody posts a family photo because you finished a book that changed how you think about money. Nobody applauds when you spend 6 months learning a skill at night after work while your friends broadcast the aesthetics of conventional progress. But applause has never been a meaningful financial metric. Cash flow is. Capability is. Leverage is. There is a reason this matters so intensely in your 20s, and it is not just economic. It is biological. This is your neuroplasticity window. Your brain in this decade is still unusually adaptive. You can absorb patterns, endure steep learning curves, and reshape identity faster than you will later, when routines calcify and responsibilities multiply. That does not mean you become incapable with age. It means the cost of transformation rises. In your 20s, you can still become someone materially different in 12 to 18 months if you direct your attention with violence and precision. You can go from digitally illiterate to competent, from shy to commercially fluent, from scattered to disciplined, from dependent to dangerous. That is not self-help fantasy. That is what happens when neuroplasticity is paired with repetition and market feedback. If you waste this window chasing prestige signals instead of high-leverage competence, you are not just spending money poorly. You are misallocating a once dominant biological advantage. And most people do this because they have been taught to see education as consumption rather than transformation. They sit in lecture halls waiting passively for relevance to be delivered to them by an institution whose incentives are not aligned with speed, adaptation, or market responsiveness. They become professional note takers in an economy that rewards operators. They confuse attendance with progress. They confuse information exposure with skill acquisition. They confuse being evaluated by a syllabus with being valuable in a marketplace. But the market is an unforgiving examiner. It does not grade on effort. It does not care if you meant well. It asks only whether you can produce a result. Can you generate leads? Can you close deals? Can you build systems? Can you make something people use? Can you communicate clearly? Can you persuade ethically? Can you manage attention? Can you diagnose a problem faster than the next person? Can you take ambiguity and turn it into money, time savings, or reduced pain? That is competence. And competence over credentials is not an edgy slogan. It is a practical asymmetry. Because once you acquire a high leverage ability, your earning power can change non-linearly. A single semester's tuition can disappear into administrative fog. But a real skill can begin paying you back immediately and keep paying you for decades. Learn to sell and you can monetize anything. Learn to write persuasively and you can influence markets, clients, employers, audiences, and opportunities. Learn code and you can build assets. Learn digital marketing and you can participate directly in revenue generation rather than waiting to be assigned generic tasks. Learn operations and you become the person who makes complexity survivable. These are not just job skills, they are economic multipliers. And the cost of entry is absurdly low compared to the mythology surrounding traditional education. A few books, a few courses, a laptop, Wi-Fi, time, humility, repetition, the willingness to look stupid while you improve. That is often enough to begin. The tragedy is that many young people will spend more on a single weekend, a single branded purchase, a single rent premium in the right neighborhood, a single image maintenance decision, than on the tools that could actually increase their lifetime earnings. This is where the forensic accounting of the psyche becomes unavoidable. Because early 20s spending is rarely about utility. It is about identity regulation. It is about trying to purchase belonging. You see the apartment, the trip, the expensive dinner, the designer object, the car payment, the curated lifestyle, and underneath all of it, there is usually the same sentence. I need proof that I am not failing. That is why so much youthful spending is economically irrational, but psychologically understandable. You are not just buying objects. You are buying temporary relief from comparison. You are trying to silence the animal fear that your peers are advancing while you are stagnating. You are trying to buy psychological safety in a decade defined by uncertainty. But relief purchased through consumption is metabolized quickly, while the financial consequences remain. You feel better for an evening and poorer for years. This is why restraint in your 20s is so misunderstood. People think frugality is about deprivation. Often it is about clarity. It is about refusing to let insecurity make capital allocation decisions for you. It is about understanding that every dollar you spend has two costs: the obvious cost of the purchase and the invisible cost of what that dollar could have become if redirected into assets, skills, or freedom. The young person who looks behind because they skipped the prestige apartment, the luxury car, the expensive campus, the reckless nightlife budget, or the image management spending is often the one silently building an escape route. They are not behind, they are under construction, and construction is rarely photogenic. The uncomfortable fact is that many people do not want the highest ROI path because the highest ROI path often requires social friction. It requires disappointing the tribe. It requires saying no to institutions your family reveres, to peers who need your participation to validate their own choices, to an entire cultural machine that monetizes your uncertainty. It requires tolerating the temporary loneliness of independent judgment. That is hard, much harder than swiping a card or signing a loan agreement while everyone around you nods. But adulthood begins the moment you stop outsourcing your future to consensus. The question is not whether a path is respected. The question is whether it cash flows. The question is whether it builds power. The question is whether it expands or contracts your agency. The question is whether it leaves you with something the market can use tomorrow. If the answer is no, the prestige is cosmetic, and you cannot compound cosmetics. What you can compound is skill, reputation, systems, discipline, and capital. Those are the real investments you must make in your 20s. Not because they sound noble, but because they are mathematically superior. Invest in personal finance literacy so you stop being manipulated by terms you do not understand. Learn how debt works, how interest extracts, how taxes distort, how savings rates create options, how risk differs from volatility, how assets differ from liabilities, and how delayed gratification is not moral purity but strategic patience. Invest in sales because every meaningful outcome in adult life involves persuasion, whether you are negotiating salary, attracting clients, building partnerships, raising money, or leading a team. Invest in communication because people who can think clearly and explain value simply are perpetually underpriced in confused markets. Invest in technical leverage, whether through coding, automation, AI fluency, design systems, analytics, or media production, because tools amplify output and the future belongs disproportionately to those who can direct leverage rather than merely witness it. Invest in health, because a dysregulated nervous system makes terrible long-term decisions. Sleep, strength, emotional regulation, and attention control are not lifestyle accessories. They are the substrate of economic judgment. Invest in relationships with ambitious, honest, competent people who tell you the truth instead of selling you comfort. That environment alone can save you years. And above all, invest in experiments. Small side hustles, small freelance gigs, small offers, small products. Small attempts that expose you to the market while the cost of failure is still low. You do not need a grand entrepreneurial identity. You need contact with reality. The market is the only classroom that grades in money. A side hustle that earns even a few $100s teaches more about value creation than months of passive theory because it collapses abstraction into proof. It shows you where attention comes from, what customers care about, why distribution matters, how hard trust is to earn, and how quickly your ego must adapt when reality ignores your preferences. That kind of feedback is priceless precisely because it is unsentimental. It gives you a way out of fantasy. And fantasy in your 20s is expensive. The fantasy that someone else will rescue you with a credential. The fantasy that security can be borrowed. The fantasy that spending can repair self-worth. The fantasy that waiting passively will somehow keep you safe. Safety does not come from compliance, it comes from capability. When you are deeply competent, you do not need to beg the world to validate your existence. You can create value in multiple environments. You can recover from job loss. You can pivot industries. You can sell. You can build. You can learn again. Competence creates resilience, and resilience is what people actually mean when they talk about security, though they often mistake it for institutional affiliation. Institutions can help, but they cannot substitute for a robust internal asset base. And that asset base is built in quiet hours through self-directed learning, repetition, correction, and the willingness to become useful before you become impressive. So if you feel the peer pressure right now, if you feel the dread of not following the standard map, detach for a moment. Do not moralize. Do not panic. Audit. Look at every major decision as if you were a forensic accountant assigned to investigate the future life of someone you care about. What debt is being proposed? What return is likely? What alternatives exist? What skills will be acquired? How fast can they monetize? What is the downside if the optimistic story fails? How much of this choice is driven by fear, status, avoidance, or borrowed expectations? That is how you regain power. Not through blind rebellion, not through performative contrarianism, but through sober analysis. You do not need to reject learning. You need to reject overpriced learning that produces weak returns. You do not need to reject ambition. You need to stop confusing ambition with expensive theater. You do not need to win the approval contest of your early 20s. You need to survive it with your agency intact. Because the people who look glamorous while quietly sabotaging their balance sheet are not ahead. They are simply more legible to a culture obsessed with appearances. Real progress is often invisible at first. It looks like discipline no one claps for. It looks like money kept instead of spent. It looks like books flagged with notes. It looks like evenings spent studying a skill instead of rehearsing a lifestyle. It looks like awkward first client calls, failed offers, corrected mistakes, incremental competence, and a growing sense that your future is no longer being auctioned off to the highest status narrative in the room. That is what empowerment actually feels like. Not euphoria, not swagger, not superiority. Just reduced confusion, more agency, cleaner math, less fear. You begin to understand that your 20s are not for purchasing an identity from institutions and brands. They are for building an identity rooted in proof. Proof that you can learn, proof that you can earn, proof that you can endure uncertainty without sedating yourself through debt and consumption, proof that you can become valuable on purpose. Once you internalize that, the herd loses its hypnotic power. You no longer see everyone else's expensive choices as evidence that you are behind. You see them as data points, often tragic ones, in a mass experiment driven by insecurity and subsidized by interest. And you realize that the highest ROI investments in your 20s are not glamorous at all. They are literacy, leverage, health, discipline, sales, communication, technical skill, and the courage to build competence while others are busy renting prestige. That is how wealth begins. Quietly, rationally, without permission. Stop blindly accepting debt as a normal part of life. Spend $50 on 2 highly rated books about personal finance and sales today. It will change your entire future.